Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. My name is Ginger Chan. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy here at the Salt Lake Chamber. And I want to thank you for joining our State of Inflation Town Hall. As many of you know, inflation hit another high in February here of 2022, making the worst numbers that we've seen since 1982 for American consumers. And our businesses are consistently talking to the chamber, asking what's being done at the federal level, what can be done from a supply chain perspective, and how long this will last. The new number measured by the Consumer Price Index was 7.9%, and we're hearing about Federal Reserve Chairman Powell, prepared to accelerate the interest rate. So we're so happy to have you all join us today as we are joined with Senator Lee and Congressman Blake Moore. And this will be an informational town hall where we will do a deep dive into the issues surrounding inflation. Our federal delegation will discuss the current state of inflation and what we can expect as we move into our summer months with gas prices and food and other consumables. So we're thrilled to be joined by two members of our federal delegation. Again, Senator Mike Lee, welcome, and Congressman Blake Moore, welcome. And the format today, we're going to turn it over to Senator Lee to tell us a little bit about inflation from his perspective. We'll ask a few questions from the senator, and then he will be dropping off here about 10:30. And then we'll turn the time over to Congressman Blake Moore and the same, allow for a presentation and a few questions. So Senator Lee, please impart us with all of the wisdom that you know from your time in DC and what we can expect from inflation.
Great, thanks so much, Ginger, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. This is an important topic. It's one that everyone's talking about in Washington, and one way or another, people are looking at the rising cost of living, and they're trying to blame it on one thing or another. Now, people in Utah are suffering the consequences of inflation, and they're both confident and very, very correct when they blame it on spending in Washington. Now, for Utahns, inflation is at about 9.7%, higher than the national average. And my Joint Economic Committee staff has put together a report on inflation and how it's impacted people differently in different regions. And for us as Utahns, we're experiencing it to a more acute degree at 9.7%. What this really means, though, as far as a per household impact, each family in Utah is now spending an estimated $582 a month more just for the basic basket of goods and services that they purchase from one month to the next. $582 a month more than they were spending at this time last year. And these are some of the highest numbers in the nation. Now, polling shows that we as Utahns are increasingly worried about inflation. Utahns know that without major changes, this inflation is going to stick around. 93% are worried about it. 75% of Utahns report that their household income isn't keeping up with inflation because people understand that wages across the board, generally speaking, have increased, but not nearly as much as inflation. And for some people, their earnings haven't increased at all. An increasingly large number of Americans identify inflation as the biggest single challenge facing our country. Meanwhile, the federal government's spending at record rates. President Biden, introduced a budget yesterday, his budget, and his budget spends trillions and trillions of dollars and projects massive deficits of over $1 trillion for each year, basically indefinitely into the future. And one of the things that's scary about that, they project that by the end of this 10-year window, 10 years from now, we will have accumulated a total debt of $45 trillion. But even that projection, oh, and by the way, at that point, we will be spending about $1.3 trillion a year just to service our national debt. But that's not the scariest part. The scariest part is that budget didn't even take into account the increasing interest rates, which I think are almost a fait accompli And it also projected inflation to be half of what it is now for this year, and then drastically lower into the future. Those are just not realistic projections, but even according to those very rosy projections, we'll still be in this scary place where we'll be $45 trillion in debt and spending, 1.3 trillion a year in interest, significantly more than we're spending on national defense. And yet, notwithstanding this, Congress and the president are still calling for more spending. Now, this is significant because we've been taught a lot by scholars like Milton Friedman about inflation and what happens to it. Friedman put it well when he said that inflation's always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more it can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output. And so he gets right to the point. This is how it happens. When we do this to our money supply, and that isn't outpaced by increases in productivity, then we're going to have it. And that's exactly what we've done through bad fiscal policy leading to more bad monetary policy. Our deficit spending, when we understand it against Milton Friedman's words, has basically ensured that there's way too much money following too few goods. So, well, I have a lot more that I could say about what's going on with inflation and who to blame. I want to start off by talking about three proactive solutions that I've been working on that I'm convinced would make a real significant difference for people in Utah who are struggling to make ends meet in this current inflationary cycle. First off, we've got to resolve the supply chain crisis. Since the COVID pandemic produced global shutdowns in the international economy and in the domestic economy, supply hasn't been able to match the pace of demand. Now, thanks to restrictive federal regulations, our ports are backed up with ships with containers in them, and then backed up at the port with containers that need to be unloaded onto trucks. Therein lies another problem. We've got a shortage of trucks and truck drivers, and in many cases, we don't have enough places to store the containers once they come off the boats. And so it's a stacked up problem there. But in short, the way I like to say it, we need to get products off of ships into trucks and onto shelves. While the pandemic exacerbated each of those problems, some of these federal regulations, like those under the Jones Act, have been holding back our supply chain capacity for more than a century. And that's why a few months ago, in November of last year, I introduced legislation called the Stop the Grinch Act to address some of these supply chain challenges and to help our country weather the storm. That in turn would help with inflation. And with no end to these problems in sight, I recently updated the bill and added some new provisions, and I reintroduced the whole package as the stopping hindrances to invigorate ports and increase trade, or SHIP IT Act, earlier this month. Let me tell you about the SHIP IT Act and the provisions that it includes. It includes, for one, a temporary waiver of hours of service requirements as they relate to truck drivers specifically who are transporting cargo either to or from ports. This would make a big difference. It also contains a temporary waiver, one that would allow 18-year-old truck drivers to receive a commercial driver's license for direct assistance to a port. It also calls for the temporary elimination of tariffs on truck chassis that are imported from countries that with which the United States have a collective defense arrangement. And it also has a requirement that certain federal agencies, in consultation with supply chain stakeholders, identify and designate plots of federal land that would be capable of temporarily being used to store and transfer empty cargo containers. This is getting to that backed up problem that I referred to. It's stopping us from getting products off of ships into trucks and onto shelves. Now, I sit on the Senate Commerce Committee, and we had a markup last week on another bill, and I was able to get 3 significant amendments from my Ship It Act adopted into the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which is going through the Senate right now. These amendments will authorize the Coast Guard to expedite these so-called TWIC credentials, the TWIC card and applications, which are essentially background checks that apply to port workers. Anyone having access to a port has to have these TWIC credentials, and we don't have enough people with them right now. It's one of the things causing the supply chain problem. It would also, these amendments that I got added to it require a report that details the technological competitiveness of U.S. ports as compared to those of our peer nations, and another provision supporting the usage of inland port infrastructure, including and especially in inland port infrastructure in Utah. We're really good at that, and our inland port in particular can play a major role in dealing with our supply chain crisis, not just in Utah, but nationwide. So these are proposals, all of them, that would help us, as I say, get products off of ships into trucks and onto shelves. Second, we've got to turn off the tap of excessive government spending. You know, runaway federal spending really is the primary contributor to current inflation levels. At the beginning of the pandemic, Congress passed unemployment insurance, a type of unemployment insurance that paid employees more to stay at home and not work than they would make if they went to work. And that meant that companies produced fewer goods and services, and they had to pay their employees more for the same work that they did. Stimulus checks also, I think, reduced work and had another impact by flooding the economy with more cash. And that's something that was ratcheting up both sides of the inflation equation at once. All that government money has only worsened the conditions on the ground because, again, we were printing more cash and doing so in a way that simultaneously reduced productivity. And so we were burning that candle at both ends and thus making the inflation problem much more significant. Now, I had members of the Utah legislature ask me recently to stop Congress from sending more money to the state. And they were not only struggling to find good, efficient uses for the money within the constraints, the sometimes crazy restraints that Congress gave, but they also knew that our state, like any state, would end up becoming dependent on these streams of federal funding, and that would ultimately have a tendency to weaken Utah's ability to govern itself efficiently and in a manner consistent with the wishes of Utah voters. Now, due to some changes in congressional procedure over the last several decades, it's become far too easy for Congress and for the federal government to spend exorbitant, unbelievably unrealistic amounts of money. And that's why I introduced another piece of legislation called the PRICE Act. The acronym stands for Preventing Runaway Inflation in Consumer Expenditures. The PRICE Act, which nearly passed in the form of an amendment to the budget resolution last summer, would require a larger number of senators, 60, 3/5, to approve of any new spending measures when the national inflation rate is at or above 3%. This is a rule that it's a Budget Act point of order, and it would make sure that Congress thought long and hard before inflicting even more inflationary pressures on the American people. And ultimately, it'd just make the federal government spend its money more wisely by increasing the vote threshold. Third, we've got to contain the rising cost of gasoline, which is soaring and was soaring long before Russia went to war with Ukraine. Look, we've got enormous energy resources in this country. We ought to be unleashing those resources and unleashing American energy production by removing federal government barriers to domestic oil and gas production. And we also need to resume offshore and onshore oil and gas leasing and do that immediately. President Biden's disastrous energy policies have weakened our ability to produce and move and process and refine energy here in the United States. President Biden, on his very first day one of his presidency, one of the very first things he did was to halt all new federal oil and gas leases on federal land. I'm still dumbfounded that he greenlit the Nord Stream pipeline to allow Germany to get environmentally destructive Russian oil and gas while preventing us from getting clean oil through the Keystone XL pipeline. Look, nobody produces oil and gas in a more environmentally responsible, sustainable fashion than we do. Nobody produces fossil fuels that burn cleaner than we do. And yet, by halting development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, development that had been approved by Congress by statute a few years ago, and on federal lands generally, he really inflicted a setback, not just for American consumers, not just a setback that led to more inflation, but also one that isn't good for the environment. Look, we need liquid fuels. We've got to have them, and they're going to be produced somewhere. When we stop producing them, or to the degree that we stop producing them, we do a couple things. Number one, we guarantee that it'll be produced somewhere else in a less environmentally friendly manner. We guarantee that the energy that is produced burns less cleanly than ours does for the most part. And we also guarantee that American consumers will pay more for the same products, and that money will go, in many, many cases, to really bad people. Sometimes bad governments, other times just bad people who profit off of our petrodollars. Now, it's hard to imagine, but a year ago, a gallon of gas in Utah cost $3.15 on average. 18 months ago, it was more like $1.85, as I recall. As of yesterday, it was $4.43, a 40% increase just from a year ago. And this is absolutely unacceptable. After banning all Russian energy imports, the Biden administration is now desperately searching, of course, to fulfill energy demand here in the United States, even resorting to asking the dictator of Venezuela for assistance. Our government has directly stifled domestic oil and gas production, and everyday Americans are footing the bill. We really should unleash American-made energy, not combat it, as President Biden's doing. In fact, it's interesting, the very type of oil that we import from Russia, with a chemical makeup that's needed as an important feedstock in many American refineries, is available in our own Uinta Basin. But many of President Biden's policies won't let us extract it, at least not nearly to the degree that we need to. Now, I recently went to a grocery store in Riverton. The store owner, the shoppers, the mayor of Riverton, they all were there, and they all told me how deeply worried they are about inflation. It's the same thing I see every time I go to a grocery store in Utah or anywhere else for that matter. Prices are sticky. And when they go up, they rarely come down. And Utahns are right. Inflation is a reason to be concerned. Through working to try to ease the supply chain crisis and reining in federal spending and helping us to contain rising energy prices, I'm dedicated on this. I'm dedicated to making sure that inflation is brought under control and to doing everything I can to make sure that you can keep your businesses profitable and your communities prosperous. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your work on some of the supply chain issues with the Ship It Act and the Price Act. We have a couple questions and we know you need to jump off and we'll lose you here in just a minute. $582 a month in Utah is a lot of money for our residents. what are you seeing in other states, and how are we comparing to other states? You said we're one of the highest. What are you seeing in other states? You've obviously done a deeper dive into this.
Yeah, we've got a chart on this that is in my Joint Economic Committee report. I don't know how much you can see of it. So the interesting thing is it's at some of its worst levels in the Intermountain West where we are. It's interestingly enough in the mid-Atlantic and sort of middle southeastern United States, we're still seeing inflation, but it's far less significant than it is where we are. There are a lot of reasons for this. Some of it has to do with energy prices. Some of it has to do with the availability of housing and land for housing, things like that. These are all things, by the way, that the federal government has an impact on, and that the federal government's, the penurious nature of the federal government's approach to these things is helping the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the middle class stalled out and in the decline. That's what's so scary about it, is that a lot of those places that are closer to our nation's capital are faring much better. They're still suffering, but not nearly as much as they are elsewhere. And so many of the people making these decisions aren't even, they're kind of outside the greatest danger zone.
Well, you touched on a little bit about short-term versus long-term, and for a while we were hearing that this was a transitory inflation, and that prices would go down. And like you said, once prices go up, they rarely come back down. What are the short-term and long-term effects of some of this inflation, and how do you see this impacting Utahns and beyond?
Well, first of all, the idea that this was transitory, or that they ever could have predicted at the time it would be transitory, was somewhat laughable. I think this was a cynically disingenuous statement by those who claimed it, because there was no indication at the time that any of the inputs, the government spending, the supply chain crisis, the energy problems, no indication that any of those things were going to change, and every indication that they were getting worse. Short term, we feel it at an individual, at a family level, very acutely. And that is bad in and of itself. It's something that, when you think about the impact of the average Utah families shelling out an additional $582 a month just for the same basket of goods and services they were purchasing a year ago, it's not like that $582 is going toward a down payment on a home or a car or something like that. This is just going into nothing. It's just to buy the same things that they need to sustain their families. And so this hurts, but as a result of that, longer term, at a family level, you'll see fewer people being able to buy homes, even at the same time that the price of real estate is increasing. That's compounding the problem for them. Longer term, I think this is going to impair many people's ability to fund their child's education. At a more macro level, when businesses are feeling the punch, as so many of them are, because all of their inputs have gotten more expensive, from labor to energy, and energy costs end up getting compounded into everything else. You'll see less R&D, less capital investment, less risk taking, and as a result of that, you'll see lower rates of new business formation. Now, keep in mind, it's new business formation that's accountable for the overwhelming share of our net job creation in this country. From one decade to the next, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, we've seen that virtually all of our net new job creation has come from startups. And so you'll see fewer job opportunities resulting from that. This is before we even get to the way that this will impact governments and their ability to fund everything from national defense to infrastructure projects. It's very, very troubling. It's deeply painful short term. Long term, it gets far worse.
So before we let you drop off, and thank you again for being here. So in addition to the legislation and some of the work that's being done at the federal level, What can businesses do to mitigate the impacts of inflation? What can be done?
Look, each business is going to have to decide for itself, based on its own circumstances, what levers they can pull. Some businesses will understandably be left with no choice but to raise their own prices. Others may be operating in an industry where the elasticity of demand will make it less favorable, less realistic to do that. And they'll end up having to cut costs. And usually the first place they turn when they do that is to reduce their labor force. In other words, fire people. None of these are favorable options. None of these are things people want to do, but there's also not a one size fits all tool. Now, President Biden talked a little bit about this in his State of the Union address. I found it quite unsatisfying when he described the whole circumstance and said, oh, it's easy to deal with this, just cut costs. Oh, okay. As if that were something novel, as if that were something easy. It struck me as almost a let them eat cake moment on steroids. Look, businesses already are doing everything they can to cut costs. The question is where and where to make up the difference. And that will vary from one business to the next.
Indeed. Well, Senator Lee, thank you for your time and your work done on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. We know that there's a lot of work to be done there. And especially right now, the time that you spent here today, considering that you're on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and this is your very busy time. Thank you for your work. We really appreciate hearing from you and how this will impact Utahns and beyond, and what we can brace ourselves for. So thank you again. And I want to be respectful of your time this morning.
Thanks so much, Ginger. Really appreciate it.
Great. Have a good day. And now we'll turn the time over to Congressman Moore. Congressman Moore, thank you for being here. Greatly appreciate it. Would love to hear from you. We know that your time is spent on the House Committee for Natural Resources. Obviously, energy is a huge issue as it relates to inflation. Would love to turn the time over to you for some remarks, and then have a couple of questions we'd like to ask you as well. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ginger. Thanks you all for joining. I was able to, as we kick this off, see a lot of familiar names on there. I always appreciated my time working closely with the Salt Lake Chamber prior to this role that I'm in now. I had worked with the chamber to be on that sort of rising bench who help. We need to create leadership for the next generation. And building that bench, it was a really unique opportunity, and I always appreciate that. And I want to still find ways in this role to encourage that. So as I see a lot of the names, thanks for leaning in and being a part of this. What I don't want to do is regurgitate any information that Senator Lee shared, and he highlights some of the key issues. You can't talk about it without sharing a little bit about that, but I wanted to maybe bring it back even to some specific examples of how we know this is affecting people. I don't have the answer what each business should do, right, to address this. This is a macro issue that inflation, you're already seeing the Fed take their effort. I'm seeing friends of mine on social media that are mortgage brokers or provide loans. They're saying, hey, do it now because interest rates are going to go up. And that's the whole point, is now we have to slow down the economy for something that we've created. And we have to be more forward thinking and be able to avoid that. I remember one of the chamber meetings that we've had that came out to Washington. In one of the Q&As, somebody had said, and this stuck with me for months now. And he said, when you load up the monetary supply, when you depress the workforce and you have supply chain issues, is anybody surprised back in Washington? Is that a shocker to anybody? And I remember, and I've used that line over and over again, that there's one equation for what's taken place. Now, let me also lay out to you all, and I always do this as a way to hopefully build credibility with people. And as I think long-term about creating a voice from within my role and communicating it back to Utah of, what are the real issues, getting down to the brass tacks of this whole entire concept. There's two things that stick out to me. So much of what gets communicated out of Washington from all parties, okay, let me go ahead and say it. There's a lens of politics that's used when talking policy, and the existence of politics intertwined with policy is a fundamental problem back here, where you're always getting, to hear what your own echo chamber wants you to hear. There's half truths, and again, half truths is sort of a negative sort of phrase, but the way that we're able to take that truth, there is a truth to that element, and we make that the message. That's, to me, what transitory inflation was. We have supply chain issues. I do not blame President Biden for all of our supply chain issues. Shutting down our economy during the pandemic, could have taken a lesson from Utah on how to provide precautions, but also keep things moving. Like the nation should have, done that more as a model. But overall, we ramped down production in a lot of different industries, and then we tried to ramp it back up quickly. That's going to cause a supply chain issue. You can parallel that with energy. I'm not saying that's not part of it. Maybe that was a predictor of, well, this just might be transitory because this is focused on a supply chain. But folks, when you load an additional $1.9 trillion to our monetary supply that has incentives to avoid getting back into the workforce as quickly as possible. And, again, that's that simple equation, right? So as the Biden administration, they're going to want to talk only about supply chain, right? Because that's the messaging that they want to create. And it is a part of it. It is a factor that went into our inflationary issues that we're facing right now. But when you load up that monetary supply and we have the great resignation, people leaving work, maybe their 401ks were good enough that they're 59, 50, 60 years old, and they've decided, my house is paid off. I don't need to get back into the workforce after this little disruption. That existed all throughout. And it's disheartening to see so much of politics get put into the communication. Let me address energy real quick and give a specific example. Not to, I appreciate Senator Lee's comments on this, and he even mentioned the Basin project. This Basin Railway project is something that I've been intimately involved. Our team has been digging in tremendously to this and kind of engaging however we possibly can. The process, this is a project that it's privately funded. This is a process that's gotten through most of the regulatory reform, the regulatory environment, to be able to give us the green light to move forward. The American people are recognizing, okay, yes, we need to continue to build up our production. Seeing firsthand for the last 15 months, how much burden we put on the private sector just to be able to go through this process. The American people are wanting it. We're creating laws that are saying we're not going to take any, oil and gas from Russia. Where are we going to make up this deficit? Like, we have an opportunity right here in Utah. It's not going to solve everything, but it's an opportunity right here in Utah, where the Uinta Basin, as I've worked with them, have shown how much they care about the environmental standards, the labor standards, and the good work that they've done over the course of a decade or so. And what we're putting this project through, and how we're trying to really constrain their ability to go do this. This isn't even a public spend, right? This is a private spend. And it's one thing after another. Even though surface transportation has gotten us through, and we've worked with Army Corps of Engineers, we've gotten through all these things, it just continually comes up with one thing after another on the regulatory side that is not creating a solve for anything related to climate change, right? This is a concept of, okay, so we are trying to get to a goal. I think our energy industry in the US particularly has done a good job of reducing emissions. We've shown that data exists from the Obama administration through the Trump administration. And, we've got enough good data that shows that we can embrace this and continue to use this as a way to diversify our energy portfolio, to work more into renewables. I give the example of Rocky Mountain Power all the time about how, the NEPA reform that exists, and I won't go into the details of this, the NEPA reform that exists, or the regulation that exists from NEPA, disallows them to embrace cleaner technology. I mean, it's mind-boggling the type of regulatory environment that we have to go through, even when the outcome is a cleaner, more renewable type technology. We're bringing somebody in to speak in a bipartisan group just to explain that a little bit more. We're hopefully going to do that in the next couple months. But the transitory example that I give, you can see it directly on the energy side. The Biden administration wants to talk about, highest production levels. We have very, very high production levels. We're almost to peak levels, right? The last meeting that I was in with Petroleum Group, American Petroleum Group, they talk about like we are approaching like where we almost were in 2019. That's true. The number of leases that are out there, not even before the moratorium would actually kick in, there's still a gap that there is leases available. But the permitting regulation that exists to just go and do that, and sometimes these leases, they're not even on areas of land that there would even be oil and gas for the production to even take place. It's another half truth. There is truth to it, but it's not the story. When you on day one do a moratorium that even Obama didn't do, right? Like you do a moratorium and you cancel the Keystone Pipeline, which is all about the transportation of it, which could be, we can argue all day whether should we transport it via truck and the emissions that are created there, or should we do it in a more in a more environmentally friendly way? Like with arguments, we can have that debate. But the first thing he did was to discourage American energy independence, right? Yeah, there's still a gap. There's still opportunities. But when you take that incentive away for producers and for investors, they're not going to embrace this. And I personally believe, from what I've seen, that they have a view ahead of them that is cleaner, investing in tier 3, investing in additional renewables, that if we want to seed that investment opportunity outside our shores, like we're not going to get to a cleaner, better future and a more environmentally sound area. So those are just some simple examples. And I try to provide that perspective because, as you remember, I came from the business world. I came from the chamber. I came from Cicero Group, management consulting firm right in Salt Lake. And as I've entered into this political world, those two things are at the forefront of it feels like every decision and everything that's being communicated back here. And in our party, we do a lot of messaging. You do a lot of messaging while you're in the minority as well. Like it's there can be those half truths and always the lens of politics, and that's going on right now with respect to inflation and energy. And then, of course, the two are very tied. To hit this regulatory piece, we're introducing the Promoting Energy Independence and Transparency Act this week. Actually, that's just going to get at the Department of Interior, requiring them to provide the accurate information within like 30 days with what type of parcels they're nominating on any type of future sales and leases. Like, we're really going to get the brass tacks. I have never shied away from talking climate. I've never shied away from talking about the environment, clean air, and I'm going to continue to do that. I just think there's a different path forward that embraces what we can do here, where we do it better and cleaner, and ultimately not have to rely so much on our foreign partners. So we're introducing legislation that's going to address that. And I do my best to try to highlight, nope, there's truth to that. I'm not making the Biden administration the boogeyman on every single thing. But if you're going to only look at supply chain and not look at unprecedented amount of spending that was masqueraded as a COVID bill, go back to the 1.9 trillion. I sincerely wish that Senator Manchin would have kind of stood up to that one, and in recognizing that was all inflationary spending. That was my first 2 months, like my first month and a half, and that happened so fast. And ultimately, you can directly link that. And you're even seeing that from liberal media. You can directly link that to all of that spending. Again, supply chain a problem, but it's not the whole picture. Like, we've got to be able to communicate these things in a credible way to help you all as decision makers in your businesses understand where you're going from here. So let me pause there. I think I didn't want to, again, share a lot of what Senator Lee had done, but systematically laying out some of those issues. Happy to address any questions.
No, thank you. And I appreciate you taking a deeper dive into the energy issue. I don't think we realize all of the work that's being done on the side of the energy, because our neighbors are complaining about gas prices. We're hearing it from everywhere, but I think that it's very complex. And you touched on something that I thought is really key. It's that it's a communication issue as well, and how it's communicated. We've talked about supply chain. I've never in my life heard more people discuss the supply chain than I have these past couple of years. I mean, it is the topic. And what is really interesting, if you do look at our ports, the numbers that are coming through the ports is about double of what it's been in the past. They've actually increased their throughput by a long shot. But the trouble is that the demand has gone up, incrementally as well. And so they can't keep up with the demand as the supply is coming through.
I mean, it's a great reason for an inland port. I didn't want to make a shameless plug to anybody out there. No, but it's sincere though, right? Like, it just shows you that that Utah is being thoughtful about this for the future, and we're going to do that inland port in a better, cleaner. I'm embracing different organizations that are trying to provide really good, sustainable solutions, electrifying, not only just like electrifying the grid, but also the power structure that goes into it. There's really good work going on with that inland port that I hope that Utah can continue to come together and recognize. That's not going to be an immediate fix, because there's some time ahead to do that, but that's just another example of how Utah's leading this effort.
Well, and I think that we are our own victims of our own circumstances in some situations. So for instance, there was a comment that came up in the chat about CDL licenses. And so right now, and you may not even be aware of this, but there's a new requirement to get a CDL license. You have to go through a series of classes that that previously were not regulated. And now that's a requirement. And in some cases, it's causing an individual who wants to be a truck driver up to $8,200 per person to get into the industry. That's a barrier. I think we're creating barriers left and right. And unbeknownst to us, we're creating barriers. And that's where you come in, and Senator Lee and our other delegation, to say, hey, hold up, we're creating problems for ourselves.
Regulation is not going to fix our housing affordability crisis either, but regulation contributes to it. The arbitrary regulation that home builders have been very credible in saying, like, we're doing it well this way. You simply do not need this. You don't need this barrier on both sides of the house. Like it's pointless to, like, they've given so many examples. I do these roundtables with different industry leaders, and that's another prime example that comes out. It's like, we are really, if we're not, that's causing 20% of the costs associated with it. And, that can be some of the lowest hanging fruit to be able to address, costs that exist throughout the industries. That will get passed on, but I'm confident will get passed on to the consumer too, because of our competition. And yes, Utah, we have a competitive home builder market. All of the names that do it. Those types of costs don't just go directly to the fat cat sitting in the CEO seat. Like, they go to the consumer. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Right, in 2017, when there was President Trump and a Republican-led Congress, like, that gets demonized a ton. Well, it's tough because I like to talk about debt. I have my own debt and deficit task force. I want to be someone that looks back at his time, however long it is, to say, I did something about the debt culture in Washington. I was able to reform some of the mandatory spending issues. I was able to look at discretionary and find areas to trim the fat, that type of thing. And the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is one thing that I've noticed that's like such an easy boogeyman to say, well, I mean, Trump added $1 trillion to the deficit. That was debt financed. We weren't able to figure out the other side of the ledger on a lot of the mandatory spending and other types of spending cuts. It's tough politically, and then when you lose the majority in 2018, like the Republicans did, it's tough. But that Tax Cut and Jobs Act, that grew middle-class wages. That's just data. You can just look at it. That grew middle-class wages. That was not just a benefit to the wealthy. right? Or to the corporations that grew wages and enabled companies to stay in our shores, and it will grow revenue that we can help counter some of our major spending problems. So that's just another example that a half truth is it can easily become a narrative, and we as a society have to be willing to get out of our echo chambers and look at the holistic picture. And that's what I'm trying to do. You always run the risk of criticizing your own party for making a mistake, but I'm fine with it. I'm like, yes, that did create debt. It absolutely did. I just think it's a more sustainable way to go about the longer term to get back to some level of balance. So let me pause there.
So you mentioned housing a couple of times, and and you touched on it briefly. We are deeply concerned about housing, and we see this, through our Housing Gap Coalition as a workforce problem. This is actually really going to hurt us economically with our housing prices just going through the roof and no supply. The Federal Reserve is looking at a rate increase. Talk to us a little bit about housing. A lot of people say, hey, it's a local issue, it's a zoning issue. That is in part true. It's complicated. Give us a little bit impart some of your insights on the housing issue.
Easiest answer for a member of the federal delegation to say, it's a local issue, it's a zoning issue. But I always try to avoid that. I dig in because there is elements of it. The part that is a local issue on affordable housing is this concept of not in my backyard. If every single community says not in my backyard and they hold their state legislator to account based on that concept, then it's not in everybody's backyard, and nobody's backyard is how would you say, subject to making some of the changes that need to take place. We have a supply and demand issue here. We don't have enough smaller units to help people get into the American dream. That's why you have people not able to buy their first home, because there's not enough, they can't afford a single family lot. They need smaller, they need a condo to start in. And there's a lot of the condos that are available. They're probably, a lot of them are for rent now. We have a simple numbers issue. What comes with that? Congestion. That's why they're not in my backyard. Congestion, air quality, things like that. So what do you have to do? You have to overlay transportation. So I have worked with Wasatch Front Regional Council. It's been a consistent relationship for the last 18 months, well before I even took this role, meeting with that group. They're a really smart planning group that helps work with UTA to find out how we can build the infrastructure that can alleviate those negative externalities like congestion, air quality, things like that, if you do have to build more units and have an area with more townhomes, because water is a constraint, and we can't just keep doing big, huge subdivisions in Wasatch Front sprawl. And I grew up in Ogden. I remember driving to my grandma's in Salt Lake, and it was like 20 minutes, so you didn't see houses. There's just none of it. It's constant, and we all know that. But we have to be willing to look at transportation infrastructure, overlay that with what the supply needs are, and then recognize, if there's going to be a solution, it has to be, we have to be reasonable about what we expect out of our local legislators and our local mayors and things like that. Because population continues to grow. That's the problem with Utah being such a well-run state and having such a strong economy, is that it will encourage more people to come. And those are the areas that we oftentimes can get involved with. And again, I go back to the regulatory piece. So I think at the federal level, regulatory and how we can help, make sure the infrastructure needs with respect to transportation is all part of it. And we just had UTA's board here just last week talking about this exact thing.
Great. Before we cut you loose, I just want to ask one more thing, and maybe put you on the spot just a little bit. We constantly hear about the tale of two Utahs, urban and rural. And curious, as we're discussing inflation, how do you see inflation impacting the two Utahs differently, or are they impacting Utah the same? Curious about your take on that.
High gas prices affects your carpool. It affects your spring break. If you're going to fly to California, It affects your commute, depending on how far you live from your work. These types of spikes in energy prices, what that does to our ag community, like it's not a convenience. I look at my wife and I, like, I'm actually sitting in a forum last summer. This is when I knew that energy prices were becoming a problem. Again, well before what we've seen over this last time. We've been focusing on this for 14 or 15 months. I'm sitting in a GOP forum on energy, and I get a text message from my wife that has a picture of the pump. And she's like, "What are you all doing back there?" Now, my wife, I love her to death. She's happy. She's, focusing on what she is. We got 4 young kids. She's not really bogged down in the political world. That's probably how she remains relatively optimistic every day of her life. That's when I knew it was hitting everyday Americans, when all of a sudden she's noticing that decisions made in Washington are directly affecting her. But again, that's a consumption thing. That's getting us, our boys, to their thing, or going out to their little league and things like that. But when you talk rural America, I mean, this is really hitting hard at livelihoods and the ability to produce agriculture, the ability to get to where they need to get to when they live further out. That's why, the Uinta Basin is a small percentage of the population in my district. And I actually lose that part of the district in the redistricting. I do gain the Salt Lake Chamber, though. The actual office is there, so that'll be fun. But that's why we spent twice as much time as the population. It was like, this is the area that's hurting. The Uinta Basin had the highest unemployment rates during the pandemic. It's a heavily boom and bust cycle. And they do not have a diverse enough economy to weather the storms of these types of issues. And so they're inconveniences to some degree. Now, these type of gas prices are not inconveniences. These are bad for everybody, but they hit worse in our rural communities because it's, there's so much that they rely on, some consistency. And we have, the only thing that the last 14 months has been is it's not consistent. There's been a lot of turmoil. I never expected this much to take place in my first few months in Congress, from across the board, from very first day when I entered in January 6th to Afghanistan to Ukraine, highest gas prices. Like, just, we're not doing what we need to be doing for the American people right now. And hopefully we can continue to be able to find ways that recognize not just half truths and kind of come to this with a more credible, holistic argument.
Well, I think that's a great summary statement. And thank you to you and both Senator Lee for your time today. We know you're very busy, and I feel really grateful and fortunate on behalf of the chamber to get 2 of you on one call at one time to talk about these critical issues that are impacting our businesses. They're not only impacting our small businesses, our large businesses, but as you mentioned, urban and rural alike are being impacted. A big thanks for everyone who joined us today. And I just want to make a reminder that this recording will be available on the chamber website later if you want to go back and review it. Congressman Moore, do you want to have any last parting thoughts before we adjourn?
No, that honestly was it. We need to do a better job. We need to, what's being done in Washington is affecting our local businesses and it's people are recognizing it, and we need to be able to communicate, what changes we're going to make. So.
Well, thank you, and have a great rest of your day in Washington. And thank you for your work. And thank you everyone for tuning in today.